On the evening of March 23, 2025, a quiet queue descended over the square in front of Istanbul's city hall, and a woman in a brown overcoat began to speak. "We are a big family, and today has been very hard for all of us," she began. "But we will win by resisting step by step. They think they can get rid of Ekrem Imamolu by arresting him. Ekrem Imamolu has defeated you before. He will defeat you 5 more times if needed. Whether he is a candidate or not, he will win, because he has become the symbol for a nation's fight for dignity." End quote. With each statement, the tens of thousands of people in front of her erupted in rapturous applause and chants of President Ekrem. Many carried Turkish flags, some of them featuring images of the state founder Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. All were there for one singular purpose. The one on stage was Dilek Imamolu, wife of Ekrem Imamolu, the detained mayor of Istanbul. 4 days previously, he was arrested by state authorities and soon sent, awaiting trial, to Marmara Prison, a high-security facility known to house journalists, activists, and political figures who'd fallen foul of Turkish President Erdogan's regime. The arrest led to an explosion of outrage, and massive protests have raged in Istanbul and multiple other cities in Turkey ever since. Here's what you need to know about that. March the 19th was the day Imamolu, who'd served as mayor since 2019, representing the opposition Republican People's Party, was arrested. Imamolu's detention was on the charge of alleged corruption, extortion, bribery, money laundering, and supporting terrorism, in particular the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. Imamolu had been in the government's sights for many years. His party, known shorthand as the CHP, is the long-term, bitter rival of Erdogan's Justice and Development Party, or AKP. The CHP candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, narrowly missed out on defeating Erdogan in the country's presidential election in 2023. Erdogan has served as president since 2014, when he won the first direct election in Turkey's history. Previously, presidential elections have been held every 7 years instead of the current 5, using a system of indirect voting. In other words, where the candidate of the most popular party would assume the office. The final indirect vote in 2007 was also the first victory of the AKP, and its candidate, Abdullah Gül, became president. The party had been established 6 years earlier by Gül, conservative lawmaker Bülent Arınç, and Erdogan himself, who was by 2007 serving in the role of prime minister. The following years saw huge turbulence in Turkey, characterized by increasing authoritarianism, the beginning of expansion of military operations against Kurdish factions in Syria and Iraq, a massive influx of Syrians fleeing their country's civil war, and a flailing economy. With it also came pronounced division in Turkish society, as well as an evolving 3-way tussle between the largely conservative voting central regions of Turkey, the CHP voting west and major cities, and the Kurdish-dominated southeast. Amidst all this, Erdogan overcame an attempted coup d'etat in 2016, allegedly orchestrated by adherents of the Islamist Gulen movement, referred to in Turkey as Hizmet. The coup saw an attack by members of the military on the AKP headquarters in Ankara and a brief conflict which led to the deaths of around 300 people. Erdogan responded with a vicious crackdown, purging both the military and civil society. Many of the arrested ended up in Marmara, the same facility where Imamolu is currently being held. As the years progressed, Turkish society only became even more fractured. The 2015 election had seen 4 parties sit in Turkey's unicameral Grand National Assembly: the AKP, the CHP, the Ultra-Nationalist National Movement, or MHP, and the Kurdish People's Democratic Party. But by the end of 2022, there were no less than 16. Various defections and resignations led to the rise of the conservative Kemalist Ili or Good Party, and others like the Communist Workers' Party re-entered parliament. The May 2023 parliamentary election continued this path of electoral chaos as yet more groups appeared. These included the conservative New Path Alliance, several Turkish or Kurdish Islamist parties, other left or right-wing groups, as well as 9 independents and 7 empty seats. Although Erdogan's AKP suffered consecutive seat losses in 2018 and 2023, it continues to govern chiefly through an electoral alliance known as Cumhur, which it entered into in 2008 with the National Movement. This has allowed the AKP to maintain power through the following 2 elections, despite not reaching parliamentary majority by itself and ruling instead as a minority government. But by the 2023 presidential election, in which Erdogan sought a 3rd successive term, the divisions had reached boiling point. Erdogan was successfully re-elected, but only narrowly so. In 2018, the closest runner-up had received only 30% of the vote against Erdogan's 52%. But on this occasion, the president failed to secure a majority in the first round of voting, leading to a second-round runoff between the top 2 candidates. Erdogan finally triumphed with 52% of the vote and narrowly edged out the CHP's Kılıçdaroğlu with a fraction under 48%. Despite this success, the following year was not kind to Erdogan. In the 2024 local elections, the AKP lost 15 municipalities, and its ally, the MHP, lost a further 3. The Kurds gained 2, while the CHP, in what was by far the largest gain, held most of its cities and won an additional 14, surpassing the AKP by more than 1 million more in what was the party's best electoral performance since 1977. The CHP is now the governing party in 6 of Turkey's 7 largest and most economically vibrant cities and controls 35 of its 81 provinces. All of this no doubt angers Erdogan, who, while mayor of Istanbul in the 1990s, was ominously quoted as saying, "Democracy is like a tram. You ride it until you arrive at your destination, then you step off." Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity, wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. Alright, so let's get some background here. Who exactly are the CHP and what do they stand for? The Republican People's Party was officially founded the same year as the modern state of Turkey itself in 1923 and more than 8 decades before the AKP. But the party was unofficially established 4 years before that by Mustafa Kemal, commonly known by his honorific surname Ataturk, or Father of the Turks. His worldview, Kemalism, is a blend of Westernism, secularism, Turkish nationalism, economic statism, and, since the late 20th century, social democracy. The latter has put it especially at odds with Turkey's right-wing factions, not least the AKP, but perhaps especially groups like the MHP, the most significant of the 4-party conservative alliance which sustains the AKP government. Now, although the CHP has taken a progressive stance on current topics including gender equality, democracy, and the rights of Turkey's large Kurdish population, which we'll return to later, this wasn't always the case. The party is the only surviving successor of the Committee of Union and Progress, a group to which many early CHP members belonged. Founded as an underground student movement in 1899, the committee became the foremost political faction of the Young Turks, seen as responsible for several brutal massacres during the late Ottoman era. The committee was the organization which Talat Pasha led, and to which Enver Pasha and Jamal Pasha belonged, collectively the 3 pashas who directed the Armenian genocide. That said, one of the group's first leaders was Ahmed Reza, the most significant public intellectual to oppose the genocide while it was ongoing. The CHP rose out of its forerunner in 1919 and modeled itself on secular organizations in the West and the cult of personality of Mustafa Kemal. Nevertheless, it was under the CHP that the notorious Varlik Vergisi tax was levied on non-Muslim minorities during the Second World War, leading to financial ruin for much of Turkey's remaining Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian communities. It was over the course of that same war that the party began to move away from Turkish ultranationalism, and it purged members accused of racism or the unification of Turkic nations, an ideology known as Turanism or Pan-Turkism in the late 1940s, through trials led by CHP leader İsmet İnönü. Over time, the platform of the party evolved further, becoming centre-left during the second half of the century and joining the Socialist International in 1995. As of 2025, it sits as the largest opposition group in Turkey with 134 MPs, or a little over 1/5 of the 600-seat Grand National Assembly. As mentioned, it benefited from a steep surge in seats during the 2023 parliamentary elections, in part due to dissatisfaction with the AKP, the faltering of the economy, as well as mass defection from the Democratic Left Party, a fellow Kemalist group whose leadership bizarrely announced support for the AKP and Cumhur prior to the election. Now, although Ankara has been the capital and seat of government of modern Turkey since 1923, it is not really the most significant city, either economically or demographically, in the country. That remains Istanbul, Turkey's most famous, and at 16 million inhabitants, by far its most populous city. While much of the country, especially the Anatolian hinterland, is AKP or MHP dominated, the city of Istanbul is characteristically divided but has been run by the CHP since 2019. Perhaps unsurprisingly, claiming Istanbul back remains a keen objective for Erdogan and his conservative backers. And their first attempt to do exactly that came in the wake of the same 2019 election, which turned out a surprise victory for the CHP through a man who was, generally at that time, a relative unknown. And his name is Ekrem Imamolu. In some ways, the rise of Imamolu to the Istanbul mayoralty must come as a source of huge frustration to Erdogan, given that he'd once held the same office himself. Aside from Imamolu's political orientation, and unlike Erdogan himself, Imamolu isn't actually from Istanbul. He was born in 1970 in the Black Sea city of Trabzon and moved to the city to attend university at the age of 17. His political career began in 2008 when he joined the CHP after several years working in his family's construction business. His first success was to be elected mayor of the Istanbul district of Beylikdüzü the same year Erdogan clinched the presidency in 2014. But it wasn't until 2019 that Imamolu shot to fame by becoming mayor of Istanbul proper as an underdog in what was one of the most dramatic political upsets in Turkey's recent history. Despite polls predicting otherwise, he won a wafer-thin victory in the election in March, taking 48.77% of the vote against the AKP's candidate and former Prime Minister Binali Yildirim with 48.61%. The result came as a shock and setback to Erdogan, who'd been re-elected president the previous year and had secured a slim parliamentary majority through his alliance with the MHP. But Erdogan was not willing to give up the city easily. He had previously claimed that if his party, quote, lost Istanbul, we would lose Turkey. Close nature of the result was enough to allow the AKP to successfully push for a by-election, and Imamolu's win was controversially annulled. But rather than boycotting the repeat election, Imamolu wisely doubled down on the fervour it generated and the increasing displeasure with both the AKP's ham-fisted tactics and the declining economy. In the rerun held in June, he won by a wider margin, taking 54% of the vote to Yildirim's 45% and a total of 28 of Istanbul's 39 districts. Imamolu's campaign to win over the Istanbulites was based on pragmatism, and he regularly attended neighborhood meetings and iftar dinners to discuss local issues with the public. This contrasted him with the AKP's Yildirim, an obvious second fiddle to Erdogan, who was rarely central to his party's rallies in a way that would have probably helped his campaign. Still, Yildirim did at least enjoy the blanket support of pro-government media, another feature of the AKP's reach. But Imamolu managed to draw votes from both the city's Kurdish minority, unhappy with arrests of several of their politicians, as well as working-class AKP voters suffering from rising unemployment and an inflation rate now above 20%. The result broke the Islamist or Conservative Party's grip on Turkey's economic heart for the first time in 25 years, a trend that had begun with Erdogan's own election victory in 1994. Following Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's narrow defeat in the 2023 presidential election, he emerged as the CHP's leading light, ahead even of its leader, Özgür Özel, and seen as a replacement for the aging Kılıçdaroğlu. He succeeded in being re-elected as mayor in 2024, this time seeing off the AKP challenge by 51% of the vote to 39.5%. It was expected by many that he would challenge Erdogan for the presidency in 2028. But now, that may be in jeopardy. With his arrest, Imamolu automatically vacated the mayoralty, a fact which, unironically, mirrored the experience of none other than Erdogan himself. At the time Erdogan was elected mayor, he belonged to the Welfare Party, an Islamist party in the opposition. But 2 years after assuming office, he recited a controversial Turanist poem at a 1997 rally in Siirt, a Kurdish city in Turkey's southeast, once heavily inhabited by Armenians and Assyrians. This was seen as an incitement to violence by the governing Motherland Party, curiously a party to which Ekrem Imamolu's father, Hassan, belonged. Erdogan was arrested and charged under Article 312, a religious hatred clause of the Turkish Penal Code, and one which was, in a twist of irony, mainly used to silence journalists speaking out about Kurdish issues. But unlike Erdogan, whose arrest resulted in a trifling sentence and a fine, the prognosis for Imamolu does not look good. This is far from the first time that opponents of Erdogan have been targeted, with many of them later languishing under heavy terms in prison. In the wake of the coup attempt in 2016, the government handed out over 117,000 convictions, dismissed over 130,000 public servants, cancelled almost 250,000 passports, and even pursued Turkish nationals residing outside of Turkey. Heavily blamed by the government was the Gulen movement's leader, Fethullah Gulen, living in exile in the United States. In May 2016, Ankara began referring to the movement as the Fethullah Terrorist Organization, or FETO, and suspected membership or affiliation was used as a severe charge to target large swaths of the public. The British government estimated in late 2023 that more than 12,000 people were still in prison and investigations were underway for almost 68,000 more. Massive sentences were handed to figures like economist Osman Kavala and social activist Selahattin Khan Atalay, who were ultimately sentenced to life and 18 years in prison respectively in 2022. The year after the coup, the AKP introduced reforms which expanded the Turkish parliament from 550 to 600 members and which granted the president sweeping new powers. These included the scrapping and subsuming of the role of prime minister, the ability to directly appoint top public officials, the right to 2 further terms of 5 years each, and the power to intervene in the judiciary, which Erdogan has accused of being influenced by Gulen. It was later revealed by an Erdogan ally that most of the army personnel dismissed in 2016 had no direct connection to the coup attempt, and the dismissals were largely based on a dubious piece of intelligence software known as the Fetometer. The hunt for dissenters has continued ever since. Only 2 months prior to Imamolu's arrest, another prominent politician was sent to Marmara. This was Umit Özdağ, an ultra-nationalist, and once member of the AKP's BAKA, the National Movement, or MHP. Özdağ ran for MHP leadership in 2016 but failed and was dismissed from the organization a few months later. He eventually founded the anti-immigrant Victor Party in 2021. Only a few months after that, he infamously challenged Turkey's interior minister and AKP member Süleyman Soylu to a fight in front of the ministry following an argument about migration. The fight didn't happen, and in January 2025, Özdağ was arrested for insulting the president. He's remained in prison ever since. Ominously, the charge of insulting the president or other AKP members has been wielded against Imamolu as well. In 2022, he was arrested for calling public officials idiots and was sentenced more than 2 years in prison. He appealed, but the case remained ongoing at the time of his renewed arrest on different charges, which came in the morning of the 19th of March, 2025. In the days and weeks leading to Imamolu's arrest, the state targeting of him and other CHP members intensified. On the 18th of March, Istanbul University annulled Imamolu's degree, citing vague irregularities. Since Turkey's presidential candidates must hold a university degree, this would effectively block him from running for president, although, ironically, the question of whether Erdogan himself holds a valid degree has been the subject of lingering dispute. The following morning, Imamolu posted a video to his Twitter from his residence in Istanbul, in which he emphatically declared, quote, "We are facing great opposition, but I will not give up. I entrust myself to my nation." As he spoke, police swarmed around his home. At 7 a.m., he was arrested and swiftly taken into Vatan Security Department before later being transferred into detention at Marmara. He wasn't the only one. Around 100 others were rounded up, including 2 other loyal CHP mayors, several prominent business figures, and Imamolu's aide, Murat Ongun, who joined him in prison on March 24th. Imamolu's lawyer, Mehmet Palavan, was also later arrested but was released after a few days. The Istanbul chief of the public prosecutor's office accused the Istanbul mayor of being the, quote, leader of a criminal organization, citing a string of allegations relating to the misuse of municipal contracts. Prosecutors also charged him with aiding the PKK through his electoral alliance with the Kurdish People's Equality and Democracy Party in the 2024 municipal elections. Further used against him was that during his mayoral campaign in 2019, Imamolu had been paid an unprecedented visit by the lawyers of Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK founder, imprisoned on an island near Istanbul since 1999, reportedly under dire circumstances. The state also seized many of Imamolu's assets, including the family's construction company, whose general manager was also arrested. The news of the mayor's arrest spread rapidly on social media, and what followed was mayhem. Turkey saw its largest demonstrations since the Gezi Park protests in 2013, and by far the largest throughout all of Erdogan's time in office. Hundreds of thousands of outraged citizens spilled into the streets, with enormous crowds gathering before the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality building and in other cities, including Izmir and Ankara. The protesters included huge numbers of students and representatives of a wide variety of political spectrums. Similar protests took place among the diaspora abroad and in Turkish-occupied northern Cyprus. Erdogan labelled the unrest evil, and the government responded with force, unleashing riot police, water cannons, and mass detention upon the protesters. Major roads and rail networks in central Istanbul were shut, as were bus routes around Ankara's Middle East Technical University. The government media blackout on the protest was put in force, and RTUK, the state agency responsible for regulating media broadcasts, restricted several opposition media sites. The BBC's Southern Europe correspondent Mark Lowen was accused of being a threat to public order and was deported. A day later, a Swedish journalist who arrived to document the protests was arrested on arrival, accused of terror-related offences, and hauled into prison. By March 28th, Ankara announced that almost 2,000 protesters had been detained by security forces. Even so, the protests continued with vigour for 9 consecutive nights following Imamolu's arrest on March 19th. Multiple foreign governments condemned the arrest and resulting suppression, and the beleaguered Turkish lira fell a further 16% in value as instability rose. It was suggested that the CHP would then reduce the scale of the protests, but with few updates as to the status of Imamolu, they have since only continued and risen in temperature. The criticism has since expanded to not only the arrest of Imamolu, but also the intensity of the state response. The protests remain ongoing at the time of writing, with many attendees having described the events as Gezi Park 2.0. One student protester declared that they would continue resisting until Imamolu was released, and called also for the release of other prisoners, including Osman Kavala and Kan Atalay. Many expressed dismay at the EU, pointing to a lack of support against the AKP, not only in the wake of the brutal suppression of the protests, but also the preceding years of increased authoritarianism. The same sentiment was pointed out in a Deutsche Welle report, noting that the AKP government had successfully made itself strategically indispensable to the West by way of the migrant crisis, which it described as explaining the flaccid response by EU leaders to the unrest. CHP leader Özgür Özel singled out the UK and its Prime Minister in particular for lack of reaction. Özel noted that while much of the rest of Europe had at least spoken out on the events in Turkey, that the CHP felt abandoned by both Starmer and the Labour Party. In a statement to the BBC, he declared, quote, "While all of Europe is reacting, the English Labour Party and Starmer have said nothing. The cradle of democracy, England, and our brother party, the Labour Party. How can they stay silent? We are really hurt." Aside from the revulsion felt by much of the public and the indignance displayed by the protesters and the CHP leadership, calls for the release of Imamolu were made by others in Turkey's political sphere. The leader of the İYİ Party, Musavat Dervisoglu, questions the evidence of the corruption case made against Imamolu in the Istanbul municipality. The main Kurdish party's co-chairman, Tunja Bahiran, went a step further, accusing the government of dragging the country into violence by suppressing the opposition. Even the Islamist New Welfare Party and the imprisoned Umit Ondag gently opposed the arrest by emphasizing the primacy of rule of law. In some ways, the attempts by Erdogan to suppress his would-be rival for the presidency mirror his own detention, which upended his term as mayor. But therein lies something of a double jeopardy for the president and his party. Erdogan's 1997 arrest didn't succeed in stamping him out, and likely only contributed to his political momentum. Only 4 years after his arrest, he co-founded the AKP and became prime minister, a role which he held for 9 years before becoming president in 2014 and remaining so ever since. Moreover, the 2019 Istanbul mayoral election could be seen as something of an indication that strong-arming the electoral system wasn't a good failsafe, since after the annihilation, Imamolu won the runoff by a wider margin, and the following election in 2024 by an even greater distance still. And in the time since, the popularity of the opposition has grown and grown, encapsulated, if not by the close-run 2023 presidential election, then by the sharp gains of both the CHP and the Kurds in the 2024 local elections, as well as the massive scale of the ongoing protests. And even in the event that the AKP successfully stymies the current unrest, the future may not be particularly assured. At 71 years old, Erdogan is only 5 years younger than his erstwhile rival Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, whose time as CHP's presidential hopeful has since come to an end, likely in favour of younger leadership. But with the AKP's cult of personality having been so long focused on Erdogan alone, it is unclear who would replace him as the central authority when he does eventually leave power, which according to the current terms of office would be 2029 at the latest. The state of Erdogan's health has also been the subject of speculation following several reported health issues and bouts of appearing to fall asleep at high-level events. With the protests now entering their 3rd week, and with criticism of the government mounting, with the economy continuing to shake, and with increasing instability taking form, the immediate future for the country seems unclear. Only time is going to tell how this all plays out. Thank you for watching.